that he would send his Spirit, and he did. And we have been using this sacrament now for 2,000 years. So when anybody says, oh, why do you go to a priest? You say, wait a second, the question is really, why don't you? Do you know something? I have heard the confessions. At 9/11, I was in Rome. I was at the Domus Pacus when it took place. And I was supposed to fly back the next day. But the problem was, there was also a jet that they tried to hijack in Rome at the Fiumicino airport, where they were going to commandeer and fly it into the Vatican to kill the Pope. But what they did was they caught them. They racially profiled, and they saw all these guys coming in with no return tickets, no luggage, and they swarmed the plane, and they got them before they could kill the Holy Father and destroy the Vatican. And so they shut down all flights out of Fiumicino until they found every single one of the terrorists that were going to destroy the church. And so I stayed there for an extra couple weeks. And when I finally got on the plane, there were so many people there, and I started I'm going to be giving every one of you a little crucifix blessed by Pope Francis and a holy card. But I started giving out those because the Pope had blessed them, Pope St. Francis, St. John Paul. And I started giving them away to everybody. Everybody took them. Catholics, non-Catholics, Jews, atheists, the flight attendants, the guys who were flying the plane. Then they actually heard that I was hearing confessions and that I was absolving sins. There I come again. All of the staff of the plane, the flight guys came in there, put the plane on automatic pilot, came, and they severed a complete section of the plane just where I would stand and hear confessions. I stood. They gave me a seat in first class, but I never sat down. So I heard confessions. I heard Protestants, Catholics, Jews. I heard everybody's confession. And they all thanked me at the end of the flight, and they said, you know something, Father? This was the first time that we have flown since 9/11 that we have peace and joy. And you know what brought them peace and joy? Forgiveness. Even the Protestants. And to this day, up in Detroit, I have a number of ministers that come to confession to me on a regular basis because they know that a priest has the power. He's the only one who has the power to forgive sins. I hear Protestants' confession anytime. You know why? Because in our creed it says, I believe in one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. That means once you are validly baptized, you can be forgiven over and over and over and over again. You see, the sacrament of confession is one of the greatest gifts that we could ever have. I know what it feels like to be afraid. When I was a young man, I was in show business, and I wanted to be a priest. I wanted to be a priest so bad I could taste it. I wanted to be a priest from the time I was a little child. And I never wanted to be anything else, so I had the sisters train me because I wanted to go into the high school seminary, and I passed. I was dyslexic, so I was a D student, but they beat it into me. God bless those nuns. And so I went, and I passed. Then I went back the next week for the interview, and they said, tell us about your home life. And I said, well, when I was about 7, I brought the priest in and to get him to convince my mother to send my dad away because he was violent and he was a drunk and women were coming into the house. But my mother is now separated, thank God, in the church. And they said, oh no, that's an impediment. You can't be a priest if you come from a broken home. And I went, what? So I went home, I was walking home and crying and thinking, what am I going to do now? I never wanted to be anything but a priest. And all of a sudden it hit me. Showbiz. No, because even though I was very introverted and very shy, I thought, you know, what's the best way to preach is to do wonderful shows that have a moral thing. And so that's what I did. I started doing that. But in the meantime, I started veering away from the church. I started going farther and farther away. And all of a sudden I was in California. I find myself in Carmel, California. And I'm thinking, gosh, it's been years. I walked past this parish and the door was slightly open and I could smell the incense. You know, when you know a Catholic church, when you can smell a Catholic church, you know. And so I'm walking past, and I haven't been in years, and I'm on my way, I think, to an opening of a show. And I was in, and I was performing it. And I thought, I'm going to go in, just what for? Why not? So I walked in, and I see this this beautiful side altar, just covered with flowers and candles, and there's a statue of the Blessed Mother there. And all of a sudden I feel, oh my gosh, I gotta go to confession. I started feeling this desire to receive the Lord. And so what happened was, I saw over here, on this side, like that door over there was a glass door, and there was a doorbell on it. And it said, "For priest ring once." And it had big once with underlines and exclamation points. And no one was in the church, so I go up to the doorbell, and you know how when you ring a door, you can hear the doorbell? Well, I pushed it, heard absolutely nothing. So I pushed it really hard, and it snapped. And it made this snapping sound. I thought, oh no, I broke it. So now I'm pushing it, and turning it, and pushing it. And all of a sudden I hear this voice behind the door, "Hold your horses!" And I went, oh, I must have fixed it. So the door begins to open, and it's creaking, and there's this glass, fogged glass, and all of a sudden this priest steps out. He must have been at least 180 years old. And he says, "Can I help you?" I says, "Yes, Father, I would like to go to confession." And he said, "Well, the confessions are in the back of the church." I said, "Well, Father, couldn't we just sit here and do it?" I was convinced he dropped dead by the time we got there. Or I would have died of old age by the time we walked there. So we sat down, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he made the sign of the cross. And I said, "Father, I'll tell you something. I have done so many horrible things. I've been in show business, and I could buy people. But, really, the worst thing, the thing that I'm really sorry for, is that I actually..." Do you really think I'm going to tell you people? I saw you looking good. Needless to say, I confessed my sins, and all throughout the confession, that's all I kept saying is, "Oh, the mercy of God. Oh, the mercy of God." He kept saying that all the time. Well, then when we were finally done, he gave me my 537 rosaries as a penance. And then I said, "Well, Father, why is the statue of the Blessed Mother all decked out with flowers and everything?" He said, "You don't know? Today's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception." And I went, "Oh, wow, how wonderful." Well, I went to Mass every single day. I didn't care if I had a show. I didn't care if I was directing. I went to every single Mass that I could every single day, and on the weekend for about 2 weeks. And then the fervor began to die, and so I missed Mass, and I remember that I was in a show, and it was kind of like a big opening. And one of the guys says, "Well, how was Mass today, Catholic boy?" And I says, "Well, I didn't go." He says, "Ha-ha! Today is Sunday. You're going to hell." And I said, "Oh no, it's Sunday. That's a mortal sin." Oh man. Well, I don't want to just bother that old guy for just one sin. I may as well collect a couple extra ones. And so of course I didn't go for a long time. And so this happened the same exact way. It happened similar. That every single time I would go to church, it happened to be, after months and months, it happened to be the Feast of Mary. And every single time I had that fervor building up, and I sought out a confession, and I went to confession, and I would go to Mass and communion every day for a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And then I would die. Well, finally I was in San Francisco. And I was on my way to teach at ACT, which is the finest acting school in the country, and I've never had a lesson in my life, but they asked me to give a seminar. And so I was on my way there, and I see St. Francis of Assisi Parish. And I think, well, it's St. Francis, San Francisco, so I'll go up and say hi, and for good luck. So I walked up the stairs, and I opened the door. I wasn't looking for a statue of the Blessed Mother, because I never even connected any of them. I never thought it was a Feast of Mary, never even put them together, and that was happened like 14 times. And so I'm standing there, and I'm thinking, oh, the smell of this church is so... And I looked at this, on the wall, there was a card table, and there was a statue. It looked like the Blessed Mother, but she was like this. There were no hands. And I thought, and there were black spots all over her. And so I walked over to the statue, And I'm looking at it, and I realized that somebody had broken off the hands, and they had put the statue from pew to pew and put candles underneath it to try to burn the statue. It was the Satanists. In fact, that's why they call Candlestick Park, because that hill was where the Satanists used to have their rituals, and at night you could see all the candles in the park up on the hill. That's why it's called, to this day, Candlestick Park. So there's Satanists all throughout San Francisco. And so I'm staring at this image, and she's beautiful. She's like a 5-foot statue, glass eyes, and looking right into my eyes. And so I'm looking there, and looking at the statue, and I'm thinking, I've got to go to confession. I've got to go to confession. And all of a sudden, I hear somebody in the church, it sounded like anyway, said, "Oh, so you're back again?" And I turned, and I looked around, didn't see anybody. I went down all the pews. I went up in the choir loft. I went checked the confessionals. Nobody. So I go over there, and I walk back over the statue, and I'm thinking, well, it must have been somebody outside. It was hot. The windows were open. And I look in the eyes of the statue and say, "Yep, I'm back again." And then I heard this: "If you do as you have done before, I will never call you back again." Instantly, I remembered that every single time I went back to the church after not going for so long, it was the Feast of Mary. And every single time, it lasted just as long as my fervor lasted, and then I didn't go back again. And I stayed in that church, and I wouldn't leave it until about midnight at night, and I was cleaning all of this gold and silver that this little Italian woman had given me with a can of Brasso and 1,000 rags. And about halfway, I was done already at about 6, 7 p.m., and so I saw this doorway that was behind this big table that she had put a sheet on where I was putting all the cleaned gold. And I opened it up, and it was just underneath the church. It was the dirt underneath the altar. And just before I closed it, I saw a sparkle. And I thought, what the heck was that? And I crawled underneath, and I dug where I saw that sparkle, and I found all of the golden vessels that were in the San Francisco fire. The church had been destroyed, and they never found them. I found them. And so I was pulling them all out, and I'm cleaning them like crazy. And at midnight, I hear a door thump, and I hear footsteps on the wooden floor coming up to the front. I'm looking at this at midnight, and I'm thinking, I got all these, I got millions of dollars worth of gold and silver and chalices. They're going to think I'm cleaning the stuff. So I immediately thought, what does a thief not do? So I jumped out in the middle of the church, and I knelt down before the Blessed Sacrament, and I struck a pose like you would not believe. I'm an actor. So there I was, looking holy, and the priest comes up. He's a little bitty guy, and he taps me on the shoulder, and I go, "Oh, Father." He says, "What are you doing here? Church has been closed since 5 o'clock. I was cleaning. You got to get out of here." I could have sneezed and blown him out the window. But so I said, okay. So he led me out the door, and as soon as I hit that door, I ran like crazy. But I had to come back after I found a priest, went to confession. And there, when I came back, there was that priest standing in front of that statue. And all of a sudden, he looked like this, and he turned around, and he saw me. And he said, "You!" And I thought he was going to put me in jail. So I ran right smack into the door, fell down. And he says, No. Who are you? What are you doing? From there, I went to Rome. He became my spiritual director, and I finally went to the seminary. But you see, I know what it's like to sin and not even to know how to say the act of contrition. I know how difficult it is. Please, for the love of God, don't stay away from so magnificent a sacrament. Mother Teresa went 3 times a week. Pope John Paul 4, 5 times a week. He had a standing order with the Swiss Guard that if he made the sign of the cross and he was standing next to a priest, even if he was a young priest, they closed the doors and he made his confession every time. And if these saints could see the value of going to confession, and why should we go to confession? Why? You know why? We're different. We don't use psychology. We're not psychologists or psychiatrists, because you know what they do? They put your whole life in front of other people. And of course you're going to make yourself look good. I mean, I remember, I think I've told one of the masses this Sunday that if you're ever going to crash a wedding, did I tell you about that? Crash a Chaldean wedding. Because they had taken a picture. And I was there in this Chaldean wedding, and I went and I said, listen, I took 2 of the fattest groomsmen, and I had one stand over here and one stand over there, and I took a picture, and I looked like that. I thought it was the best picture I've ever taken. Because you always make yourself look better if you compare yourself to other people. But you see, God wants us to compare ourselves with him, with Christ Jesus. I mean, I remember when I was a student in high school, we had, I love mechanical drawing. I love designing homes. And they said, design a home with 2 features that have never been thought of before. And so I made a geometric dome with a fireplace with fire coming right out of the water in the center of a living room. And then the second thing was, what I did was I created it so that every year, from the time they bought the house, all the lights would just slightly dim, just a little bit more, a little bit more, a little more, every single year. And the teacher looked at me and he said, the geometric dome I can understand. What's this dimming the light stuff? And I said, well, as you get older, I'm in high school here, you usually get frumpier. You know, stuff begins to sag, you get wrinkles. And I figure every year if the lights get dimmer, there's going to be a time when you always look good to each other. And he looked at me and says, what gave you such a stupid idea? I said, my mom. And he says, what do you mean? I says, well, my mother says every time we go out, she says, let's go to Antonio's because the light is lower there and I always look better in dim light. I didn't get a good grade on that one. The geometric dome, I nailed that one. But you see, we have a tendency to make ourselves feel and look better. And that's something that never does justice to us, ourselves. We need to place ourselves in front of Christ. He calls himself, I am the light of the world. Have you ever seen these sales where you go to a hotel and all the artist's work is $25? Even a sofa-sized painting is no more than $25. Come and buy yourself a work of art. Well, a friend of mine had a big gigantic wall in his condo. And he says, I'm going to get a big gigantic piece of art for $25. I said, then go and pick up a $45 dimmer over at Home Depot. And he says, why should I pick up a $45 dimmer? I said, because the brighter that painting is, the uglier it's going to look. You turn the lights down, it's going to look like $1 million. We do this ourselves. So we need to turn up the light so that I can see myself as I really am. Mother Teresa didn't go to confession so often because she was a sinner, but because she realized those little things in her that needed to be corrected. You see, every time we go to confession, there's 2 kinds of confession. There's a confession of restoration, which means I go to confession because I'm in the state of mortal sin. And every time I go, what happens is I'm restored to the grace I had before I fell. And then there's a sacrament of devotion. Say, for example, a month goes by and you don't sin mortally. You can most certainly receive forgiveness of sins by using the sign of the cross and holy water. And venial sins can be forgiven just by saying a Hail Mary. But if you go to confession and you place yourself before God, not only are the venial sins forgiven, but you grow in grace and you reduce the temporal punishment due to sin. Now, that doesn't mean you go to confession every day. Mother Teresa had different priests coming every day to see her, and so she had that privilege of going to confession often. But to go to confession on a regular basis is necessary for me. To encounter Christ is to encounter mercy. Because remember, I go to confession, you go to confession not to meet the priest. You go to confession to meet Jesus, the merciful Jesus. Because the day of your death, you are not going to be meeting the merciful God. You are going to be meeting the justice of God. So now is the time for mercy. Now is the time when we come and we finally receive the forgiveness of our sins. And you know something? When God forgives, he forgets. Do you know what the difference between a saint and a sinner is? Do you know what the difference between a saint and a sinner is? One confession. That's all it is. And I don't care if your sins are as multiplied as many as the stars in the sky. It makes no difference. Come to confession, because nothing you have ever done could ever be an obstacle to loving God today. Nothing you have ever done will ever make me or any priest look at you with anything but the highest respect and even love. Because when you come to confession, that fulfills our priesthood. It is the purpose for our very lives as priests. Come to confession. Don't ever be afraid. John Paul, when he became Pope, he said, fear not. Come back. Come to love. Know love. Become love. That is why we have confession. That is why Christ gives us this opportunity that we can use now when we're alive. You know, I know when you get old, like I am, and you burp dust, I know you think that you don't sin. And I remember I was in Missouri, and there was a sweet little old lady in the front pew. And I was saying just what I'm saying now, and she raised her hand and she said, "Father." I said, "Yes." She says, "Father, I'm 97 years old. I don't sin. What could I possibly confess?" And I looked at her and I said, "Oh, well, you could confess you just lied to a priest." It says in the Old Testament that the just man sins 7 times a day. To say that you don't sin means you're so far away from reality that you better start getting a grip. Because we all sin. In fact, when I was in the seminary, I asked my spiritual director, because before I was going to be a priest, and I said, "Father, please tell me, when are these temptations going to end?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, figure out how long you're going to live and then add a week." Because you know something? Temptations are not sins. They're not sins. They're opportunities. You can't become a saint without a temptation. You see, you are not responsible for anything that pops into your head until your brain touches it. Once your brain touches it, you have a choice to make. Either you go with it and it becomes a sin, or you reject it and it becomes a grace. That same thing with distractions. How many of you get distracted during prayer? Raise your hand. Everybody does. And do you know that you receive way many graces when you say the rosary, for example, with other people than you do when you say it by yourself? And do you know why you get more graces when you pray the rosary together? Because it's a pain. Have you ever prayed the rosary with other people? One person wants to say it like his pants are on fire. The other one thinks that the word womb and Jesus should be separated. So they say, "Let's just put thy womb, pregnant pause, pregnant pause, pregnant pause, Jesus." And then the other one, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Oh. That's why you get more grace, because it's more difficult. Distractions now here I got to tell you something, and please write it down. Every return from distraction back to your prayer is an act of love. It's an act of love. Distracted prayer can be more powerful, more important, more grace-filled than if you were wrapped to the heights in contemplation. Because when you're wrapped to the heights in contemplation, it's a gift from God to you. But when you struggle, it's your gift to God. Oh, there's a lot of temptations and a lot of faults and a lot of things. And even if, you know how have you ever lost your temper?